Yep, our next to last topic, which is a very important one about protecting your company, and it's over insurance. Title of the program is Insurance 101 for Business Owners. We have two fantastic speakers that can take insurance and explain it in a way that even I can understand it. The first is Marisa Jeffrey O'Sullivan. Marisa is a principal at Amy Stewart Law. She obtained her bachelor's degree from the University of Missouri and her law degree from SMU. Marisa is a quick study with a tireless work ethic who has experience and know-how of a lawyer many years her senior. Her ability to focus on issues, identify the pressure points, pinpoint opportunities for resolution have allowed her to achieve outstanding results for her clients. Her strong litigation background, coupled with her judgment, serves her clients well during many hearings, depositions, mediations, and settlement negotiations that she has handled. She also has significant experience doing complex coverage analysis for clients and has primary responsibility at Amy Stewart Law for managing large-scale discovery. She serves on the board of directors of the Dallas Women Lawyers Association and the Dallas Association of Young Lawyers. In 2019, she was named the Outstanding Young Lawyer from DAYL for her accomplishments as a tenacious advocate for her clients and for the countless contributions that she makes to the Dallas legal community. The second speaker is Katherine Fayne, Katherine Fayne, who is of counsel with Amy Stewart Law. She focuses on complex property claims and business interruption losses. Prior to joining Amy Stewart Law, Katherine clerked for federal judges in Dallas for over 4 years, where she gained invaluable insight that allows her to evaluate the client's legal issues from the viewpoint of a judge. She also worked for a commercial litigator for some of the country's most prestigious law firms. Her reputation for exceptional advocacy earned her selection to the Texas Super Lawyers list of Texas Rising Stars from 2013 to 2016. She is active in the Junior League of Dallas. She also provides pro bono legal services as a volunteer with the Dallas Volunteer Attorney Program. Katherine obtained her bachelor's degree from Northwestern University and her law degree from NYU. So Marisa, Katherine, and we'll turn it over to you guys.
So for those of y'all that stuck around for a very exciting topic at the end of a Friday, we're going to try to breeze through this and make sure we have time for questions. Insurance, as Justin said, is a very important part of starting or maintaining a business. Katherine, you can go to the first slide. And we just want to talk about why insurance is important. If you haven't already figured it out, it is a risk mitigation tool. It's one of the biggest risk transfer tools that businesses have. So if your company has been sued or sustained a loss and you need to identify the policies, it's important that you know generally what kind of things these cover so that you can pinpoint which ones to look at for coverage. Most insurance policies require prompt notice under their conditions, and so it's important that you move quickly in identifying these policies and make sure you're compliant with the terms. The availability of insurance, meaning the money that you have, could impact how you settle a case or how you resolve a property claim, for instance, based on what the insurer is telling you is covered and not covered. And then last, if there is some sort of dispute that's brewing with the carrier, it's important that you know who to reach out to towards the beginning of the claim so that you can get some help with navigating some of these complex provisions. The next one. Okay, here's the best part. Insurance is really important and everybody wants it because the idea is that you get money from it, right? So what we're going to talk to you about today is just sort of an overview of insurance. Make sure that you have a little bit of education about what types of policies cover, which will hopefully allow you to have a toolkit that lets you issue spot and then work your way to this money that everybody wants. Next. So generally what we'll be talking about today, we're going to explain this concept of third-party policies that's in the title in just a second. But there are lots of different policies that are available to business owners. Commercial general liability, directors and officers, fiduciary, employment practices, cyber, professional liability, and errors and omissions, which could be the same or could be different. Commercial auto on the liability side also.
And we're also going to be talking today about first-party policies, which will, again, tell you a little bit about what we mean when we say third-party versus first-party. And some examples of those policies that we're going to talk about a little bit today are property and business interruption policies, cyber policies, crime and fidelity policies, kidnap and ransom policies, and then the first-party side of commercial auto policies, which are protecting your own vehicles. So here it is, third party versus first party. What does that mean? When we talk about that in the context of insurance, a third party policy protects you for liability from others. So, you get sued by you have a business and someone falls down in your store and breaks their leg. If they bring a lawsuit against you, a third party policy would provide coverage potentially to help you defend that lawsuit, and also to what we call the indemnity piece of it, which is to pay any judgment or settlement that you reached with the person that had sued you. So general liability policies, errors and omissions, if you have a professional services firm and you're sued for professional malpractice, those are all claims, third-party claims are claims that other people bring against you. First-party policies cover instead your own injury. So we see this a lot in the property context. A property policy, like your homeowner's policy for your home, if you own business property, the property policy will cover, if there's a hailstorm and you need to have your roof replaced, or there's a tornado and your building gets blown away, or there's potentially if there's a hurricane and there's flooding or various other risks. So that's what we consider first-party injuries, and that's what first-party policies cover. Some policies have kind of a mix of coverage of both. Homeowners, auto, and cyber policies also often provide both kinds of coverage. So they'll have coverage where, if you're, and Marisa will talk more about cyber, but if you're processing credit cards and someone's credit card gets stolen and they bring a claim against you, that would be something that would be a third-party claim. But that kind of policy could also cover, damages to yourself if you've been damaged by ransomware attack or something like that. So some of these policies will include coverage both to protect you and to protect third parties who may have claims against you. And the other big conceptual piece that we'll talk about first before we get into the specific policies are the different kinds of coverage. In general, we talk about occurrence-based and claims-made coverage. And this distinction just depends on what policy responds to what. An occurrence-based coverage policy, go back to my slip and fall example. If you have a commercial general liability policy that was in effect in 2015 and someone has, this is probably a bad example because this might all be time barred, but if someone fell in your building in 2015 and files a lawsuit against you in 2016, then it would be the policy that was in effect at the time of the accident or the occurrence that triggers and that will respond to the claim. So CGL or general liability policies like this, property policies are often like this. If you have damage to your property, it will be the policy that was in effect at the time the damage happened, when the storm was, when the tornado was, when the fire was, even if your claim comes somewhat later. The other kind of coverage is claims-made coverage, and those are policies that are triggered based on, well, the policy that responds is the policy that's in effect at the time that the claim is made. So if you're a lawyer and you've got a malpractice policy, and you're alleged to have committed malpractice in one year, but you get a demand letter in a different year, or a lawsuit is filed in a different year, then it's the policy that's in place when the demand is made. When the lawsuit is filed, when someone makes a demand to you, that's the policy that will respond. And so it matters in terms of evaluating which policy and making sure that you've got coverage in place over the years when you're in business, and sometimes for claims-made coverage, ensuring that you have coverage, even after after you've wound up your business because claims could still be made against you. So the liability, the professional liability, errors and omissions, D&O policies, directors and officers, and fiduciary liabilities, these are all the kinds of policies that tend to be more of the claims made coverage, where you look to when the lawsuit was filed or the demand was made, rather than to when the underlying action triggering your liability happened.
And y'all, just to draw a clean line between these two concepts, the last slide about first and third party liability has to do with the type of policy. These are different types of policies. This slide has to do with the when, the timing. So it's not that you would, instead of going to your general liability policy, you would go to a different policy. It's which general liability policy is triggered for this particular injury. So this occurrence-based versus claims-made is a timing thing. If you have continuous coverage with if you have continuous commercial general liability coverage, it's going to be a question of not, do I go to a different policy? It's just, which commercial general liability policy do I go to?
Thanks, Marisa. And just kind of, bringing all of this together, and these are the sorts of policies that you see the timing issues matter. So a general liability, a commercial auto liability, those kind of cases, again, like Marisa said, if you've got a general liability policy every year for 10 years, you look to it'll be the policy that was in effect when the accident happened or the offense happened. That will be the policy that's likely to respond. And you do get sometimes into issues as to which policy, if sometimes occurrences happen over many years, but I think that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But just know that those are policies that you look to. You may have a claim come up and you may have to go back a few years. May not be your current policy that would be responding. It might be a policy that you've had several years ago. And then claims made coverage are these liability policies that often cover, wrongful acts and look not to when that act occurred, but look to when the claim was made. And so they're more responsive. They cover a period of time, and any claims that are made during that policy period will trigger that policy in most cases. So here's a really fun slide about reading insurance policies. But insurance policies, getting an insurance policy from your broker or agent, it coming in the mail, it may not be a very exciting piece of mail for you, but it's a really important piece of paper for your business in protecting you and your business and your property and all of those sorts of things. So I would really encourage you to look at your insurance policies and ask questions of your agent and broker if you don't understand them, because it's important to look. And a lot of times the courts will, if you receive a policy, in some circumstances, the court will presume that you've read it and know the contents of it. And so those are, you want to take a look or have someone in your office take a look just to make sure that what you have is what you thought you were asking for and you got what you asked for. But every insurance policy, one of the first pages will always be the declarations page. It's one of the most important pieces of the policy. It should list the name insured. If you have if you're insuring multiple entities, or if you have subsidiaries that you want to be covered, it's really important to make sure. We fight this fight a lot, and sometimes when parties are named incorrectly on the policy. This is one dispute that we see a lot. So you want to make sure that the insured is named correctly. It's the entity that you meant to insure, and also that whatever other parties that you want to be covered by the policy are on there too. The policy number, the policy period will tell you the date and time that the policy is in effect. The limits of liability, this will be important to figure out just how much insurance you have. The deductible is similar to like a homeowner's or auto. It's the amount that you need to pay on a claim before the insurer will kick in. In some policies, it's called a self-insured retention instead. And then the types of coverages. Depending on the kind of policy you get, sometimes you'll get a package policy that will put together a bunch of different types of coverages. Sometimes it will just be like a general liability policy, but usually there'll be some sort of list in the declarations about what coverages you have and whether there are sublimits or special deductibles for those coverages. Sometimes those are in the declaration, sometimes those are in the policy. But it's important to know. I had a case recently where it was a retail business, and they they had a building, like the roof collapsed onto the building, and they weren't going to be open for several months while they figured out what to do. And they came to us to evaluate their business interruption or their business income coverage, which would cover the losses to the business in the time that their property wasn't available to, to be a retail store. And when we looked at the policy, they had never purchased this policy. There was no business income coverage. Whether they had purchased it and thought they did, or if it was not included correctly, I don't know. But those are the sorts of things you want to look for, that you've gotten what you've asked for and gotten what you paid for. There will be schedules to your policy. Again, the insureds, like I mentioned earlier, if you have a number of entities that are all insured under the same policy, those will be there in a property policy. You'll usually have a schedule of locations. Those are the actual physical places that are insured by the policy. And then kind of the heart of the policy and what the insurer agrees to do is what we call the insuring agreement, which is a statement of what the insurer has agreed to insure. And that is where every coverage analysis starts. So that will always be a part of the policy. The policies will always list exclusions and conditions, and we'll talk about some of those that we see a lot for the different types of policies as we go through a little bit more. And then it will include definitions, and these are what we fight about in our law practice all the time. The meaning of a word can tell you what is covered or what the insurer will pay for. It can trigger an exclusion so that there is no coverage, but it's really important to read those definitions. And if you're in a specialized kind of business where there's specific coverage that you're looking for, you might want to look at the definitions that pertain specifically to your business. And then there are endorsements, and you can have your form policy, and then you can have 5 or 10 or 50 endorsements, and they can change anything in the policy. They can change the insuring agreement, they can change the limit of insurance, they can change all sorts of things. So it's important to look at those, and that's an important place to look to know what changes are in your policy. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the specific different types of policies that you might have for your business, or you might want to think about purchasing for your business. And we're going to start with CGL, or Commercial General Liability, which is probably one of the most common policies that most businesses own. And general liability policies have different kinds of coverages. On our chart here, we've got coverage A, and that is coverage for property damage or bodily injury. So someone gets hurt, someone gets hurt in your business, or there's someone's property is damaged on your business. That will be the coverage that responds. And so a lot of times personal injury cases will trigger coverage A if your business has been sued, one of your employees has been alleged to have been negligent in causing those injuries. Coverage B of general liability policies cover more. Well, and let me just go back to say coverage A, those are generally accidents. There's an accident that causes these injuries to someone or to someone's property. Coverage B covers other things that tend to be more intentional acts. So there's coverage for personal injury as opposed to bodily injury, and that includes claims like false arrest, detention, or imprisonment, malicious prosecution, or wrongful eviction. So if you're a landlord and you get sued for wrongful eviction, you may have coverage under coverage B of a commercial general liability policy. And then in other cases, if you're advertising or you're making statements, there can be some coverage for what's called advertising injury in the nomenclature of these policies, like libel, invasion of privacy, using another's advertising idea, and in some cases, copyright infringement can be covered by these policies as well. And just back to what I was saying a minute ago, coverage A is triggered by an accident, which is something that's unexpected from the standpoint of the insured. And coverage B, those offenses that trigger that coverage are more intentional. You may not intend the results, but you generally have intended to take the action that is being complained about.
And y'all, CGL policies are issued on a form. We're going to talk later about some that aren't, but generally CGL policies themselves are issued on a form, and this is when the endorsements become so important, because endorsement sounds like a really friendly word, right? Like you're getting something for free or whatever, but a lot of times they can take away coverage, they can add coverage, they can add different kinds of coverage. There are lots of things that can be added to a CGL policy that are in the endorsements that are outside of what we just talked about. So that's why those endorsements are so crucial to understanding what your policy actually covers, because if you just look at the form itself, they all pretty much play out the way that Katherine explained. So you're going to have those basic coverages in there. The exclusions are pretty much going to be the same, but then you have to look at the rest of the pages to make sure you really understand what the scope is. So directors and officers is one of those non-standardized policies that I'm talking about. Directors and officers has a couple pieces. It does cover the directors and officers for two different types of things. One, liability that would be indemnified by the company itself. Two, liability that's not indemnified. And then there's company coverage. So not for a director and officer, just for the company itself. And again, keep in mind, this is one of those third-party liability policies. So it all has to do with someone that sues you and what happens after that. So the entity coverage, if we're talking about from a business perspective, will be pretty broad. Like it says in this first bullet point, a lot of times it'll just say, acts, errors, omissions, or negligent acts, errors, and omissions, something like that, where you could fit a lot of lawsuits into it, right? The way that this gets tailored down is through the exclusions, which is on the next slide. And they add these exclusions to make it clear what they're actually covering. So the insuring agreement will be very broad, but then you have to read it in conjunction with some of these other things here. So they're not going to cover intentional fraud or dishonesty, personal profit. They're not going to cover claims by other insureds. And this kind of goes for a lot of third-party policies, right? Because they don't want your co-owner, Jeff, to sue you, and then you guys kind of collude together to make a bunch of money off this lawsuit. It makes sense. The same for breach of contract. Usually those are intentional breaches of contract. There's not really a way to make them unintentional, and policies will exclude them. You can go to the next slide. Okay, this is another third-party liability policy that's pretty common. It's employment practices, which is exactly what it sounds like. These are claims from employees that have to do with wrongful discharge, wrongful termination, harassment, defamation, things like that. And the most common issue, common issue that we see here is that our companies don't give notice when they should be giving notice. And so it's very, very important under these policies in particular, but under all of them, to make sure that you understand what the definition of a claim is. So the insuring agreement will say, we will cover claims arising out of blah, 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 blah. That word claim has a specific definition that you have to go look at, because if you have a claim, it triggers your notice obligations. And the number one issue that we see with employment practices policies is that companies don't know that an EEOC claim is a claim. They get an EEOC, they don't really pay attention to it or take it seriously, or they think they can resolve it, which is all perfectly reasonable, but then they're not able to. It develops into a lawsuit, and then they're too late on notice, and it gets denied. So keep that in mind for these. You can go to the next slide. And then you have some common exclusions, right? So these are common because these policies, these employment practices policies, are very tailored to what they're intended to cover. They cover employment claims, and employment claims are defined. They're a specific thing, so they don't want to cover any of this other stuff. You can go to the next slide. This one kind of dovetails with it, right? Because employment practices policies will exclude workers' comp claims, that means they're driving you to go purchase a separate workers' comp policy. Unlike a lot of these other liability policies we're talking about, workers' comp is very standardized. It's heavily regulated. The number one issue we usually see here, if there's going to be an issue, is that the company has sent employees to work in a different state outside of Texas, and they don't have coverage outside of Texas. So if you have a workers' comp policy and you are sending people to work in Oklahoma, Missouri, or whatever, just make sure that you're looking at the policy and the endorsements to make sure that's covered and that you're not geographically restricted to Texas or some other list of states. Then the other thing that we see quite often under these policies is that they're oftentimes based on a retroactive premium. So what that means is the insurer will charge you a certain amount up front, but it's just a guess. And then after the year's over, you two together will go through and true up your books. And what this looks like is gathering your payroll information, your employee information, and a lot of times they have requirements if you have subcontractors or independent contractors working for you. They'll have requirements under these policies that those folks have a certain amount of insurance. And if you can't prove that they had that amount of insurance, the workers' comp carrier is going to charge you more in premium. So just know that what you pay at the beginning of the year oftentimes isn't what you're going to pay in total. So you very well may get a bill. Same thing here, just make sure you give notice promptly after an injury so you don't get in trouble. Okay, professional liability, and the E&O up here stands for errors and omissions. Usually these policies will be phrased something like, we'll cover claims for wrongful acts. A lot of times it's tied to, we'll cover claims for wrongful acts in the rendition of professional services. And this professional services phrase is something that's defined. So that's why Katherine was saying the definitions oftentimes will drive the coverage. If you just read the insuring agreement by itself, you can't really guess what it means until you go and find what professional services means. So for instance, it could be technology services, engineering services, something that requires you to have specialized training. It's kind of at the core of what your business does, right? So for technology companies, a lot of times they will have a professional liability policy that will talk about the types of technology services they provide, and that will be in the definition of professional services. You can go to the next slide. Okay, yes, so this is right. Acts particular to the specialized vocation. Sometimes, though, I will say, you can get errors and omissions coverage tacked on to a different kind of policy. So it does not have to be a standalone coverage. A lot of times we've seen them in endorsements to those CGLs that we've been talking about so much. And they will simply say that they are covering you for negligent acts, errors, and omissions. It's much broader sometimes than that definition of professional services. So that's a conversation to be had with your broker, what's available to you and what makes sense for you to buy. But the same thing here, if there is a definition of wrongful acts, make sure that you pay attention to it. These are not standardized policies either. So anything that's in the definitions or the endorsements can change kind of the meaning of the coverage. All right, fiduciary liability, probably not something y'all will need to buy off the bat if you're starting up a new business, but it's essentially coverage for your fiduciary duties under ERISA and similar employee benefits laws. And so it we'll talk about employee benefit plan creation and amendments and terminations. Again, you might develop into this, like you might want some employee benefits coverage, but this is a very specialized type of policy. Okay, cyber. Cyber is something we touched on a little bit earlier. This is probably the least standardized of all of the non-standard forms, just because it's relatively new in the insurance market as all these policies go, and it's constantly changing, just like the technology that's available to y'all. So there are usually two components, like Katherine talked about. There is cyber liability coverage, which is third party. That means, you know, if you get hacked, for instance, and you do have some consumer data and they sue you for exposing their personal information, this type of policy could cover you. It's also, you know, if you have other companies' information and that gets hacked and you get sued, same deal. So we're talking about data breach liability, computer networks, privacy, virus transmission, if you're used as a port to send a virus to somebody else, things like that. It also generally includes first party coverage, and that means what money you spend when you get hacked or what money you lose, right? So if you do get some credit card information hacked, oftentimes you have to send out notice. It's required under the law, so they'll pay for that. They have event management coverage, which could be like some public relations expenses or a call center. They pay for investigation, data restoration, and cyber extortion, meaning someone who says, we're locking down all your systems unless you give us 500,000 Bitcoin. Those type of things can be covered under cyber policies. And then last, the one that people use a lot is this business income coverage due to cyber events. So it can either be from a breach or just some type of system failure that happens. You know, there's not necessarily a bad actor. Your system goes down and you can't run your business without it. Oftentimes there's cyber coverage for that. This third bullet point here says it fills certain gaps. It fills the gap. All the other insurers have realized how expensive cyber issues are. So they are consistently driving, funneling that into this specific policy. They will put exclusions on their policies to say we're not covering any data because all that stuff's really expensive. That being said, again, oftentimes you don't have to buy a standalone cyber policy. You can ask your broker if they have it available in a package. So I've seen it added on to a CGL policy before. With it's limited, right? So it's not as robust as a standalone policy would be, but it's available. Okay, next slide.
Sometimes I add it onto property policies too. Sometimes there's coverage of property policies too.
All right, so we talked about this a little bit, but I think the thing to note here when you're looking over these bullet points of what third-party coverage, what it could cover, sometimes you can find cyber policies that do not have to relate to a breach. So there can be coverage lurking in cyber policies for disparagement, libel, slander that does not have to do with a computer. So just make sure that you check it. You could have some freebies there. Sometimes they don't tie it directly to some sort of breach. Then the other thing, you know, the other interesting thing here is that a lot of these cyber policies will cover regulatory liability, because if you, for a lot of the privacy stuff, if your consumer data gets out, a lot of the regulatory bodies could come after you, and these policies will often cover that. Okay, and then first party coverage we talked a little bit about, but This one will often respond first before you get a lawsuit, so it's really important. You could be provided with credit monitoring, a breach coach. Investigation, like I said, is very important to make sure it doesn't happen again, hopefully. And then the data restoration, company's own losses due to whatever the cyber issue was, is often really important to our clients. Next.
I'm going to talk a little bit more now about some of the other policies, a lot of these that have more first-party coverage. That's a lot of what I do. If you own vehicles, if you have employees that use their own cars to do work for you as an employer or for your business, commercial auto coverage is really important. This can be like anything else. You know, policies are written different ways. A lot of pretty standardized business policies we'll see as a package policy that will have general liability, property coverage, and auto policies. Some commercial general liability policies will have an endorsement giving you some auto coverage as well. So there's different places it could be, but it's important if you have people driving on behalf of your business. So like cyber and some, like as we discussed before, these policies have a mix of third-party and first-party coverage. In the auto context, it's kind of like your own personal auto policy. So third-party coverage protects you from claims from third parties. If your car gets in, if your employees, if your business vehicle gets in a wreck and someone is hurt or their car is damaged, then that third-party coverage would respond to that kind of a claim. But if you have a collision and you hit an uninsured driver or something like that, then there's first-party coverage like you might have in your own personal auto policy as well. And there are a couple other kinds of commercial auto policies. In general, commercial auto policies, when they refer to that, insures the cars and trucks that you own, lease, rent, or borrow. But it's also important, like I said, if you have employees, driving their own cars to do errands for your business or during the business day, if they're going to business meetings and they're driving their own, or if they're on a business trip and they rent a car, then you can get a hired and non-owned auto policy, and that will cover your employees' liability when driving their own cars or rental cars and keep you from having to pay the excessive rental insurance fees at an airport. Commercial property is it's been a really big topic lately, and these policies can cover a lot. So property policies, as I said in the very beginning, they not only cover your physical buildings, your real property, and your business personal property, which would be all the things that you use to run your business, your computers, if you own a gym, probably your weights and different machines. But it also can cover business income or business interruption if there's, something that happens to your property. So property policies in general can be written for locations that you own or that you lease. And sometimes it's important to make sure that you're complying with, if you lease your location, you might want to look at the insurance requirements in your lease, because sometimes you need to add your landlord as an additional named insured under your policy, which can be important if there's a loss, or there's a loss to the building and also to your personal property inside. They also might require you to insure that space or that building. And these kinds of policies generally are written on two different kinds of ways. And to go back, I know Marisa was telling you when these policies were more form and more standard. In property policies, there's kind of a mix. It kind of depends on how big of a business you have. And typically when we see property policies that have, millions or even billions of dollars of coverage, those policies typically are pretty negotiated and very specific to the business that they are insuring. If you're, starting out and you have a small business, or you're just working with a general business broker to get your insurance policies, there are a lot of form policies. So there are a lot of, similarities in the policies that are issued for property for small businesses. But in general, there's two different kinds. So there's all risks policies, and a lot of commercial property policies are like these, and they're very broad. And the policy just says that it insures all risks to the covered property except for those specifically excluded. And it's important to look at the exclusions and think about where you are and what sort of risks there are to your property. Sometimes, either hail or will be excluded or subject to a higher deductible. If you have property kind of closer to the ocean where you have hurricane risks, windstorms are often either excluded or subject to different limits or deductibles. And flood insurance is one that's, some property policies will cover damage from flood, others don't. And if you need to know if you're in a flood zone and whether you need to go and look for, different separate flood insurance. So there's all risks, which cover everything unless it's excluded. And then there's covered perils policies that are typically narrow, and they'll say, we cover windstorm, hail, flood, fire, and they'll list the things that they cover. And if you have some other sort of damage that doesn't fall into one of those enumerated risks, then you may not have coverage. And then there's the business interruption piece of property policies. Again, not every property policy includes this. So it's important that if you are concerned, if, as we're learning in this COVID world, that things can happen in a remote way that we might not have ever experienced before. But if you have a store and you sell things, or you own a restaurant, or you're a hotel, and if something happens to the physical property where you do your business, and that you can't provide your service, or you can't have clients, or you can't sell the things or manufacture the things that you sell, then this could be a very important coverage to you. And it's been really litigated a lot. A lot of people have filed claims under their business interruption insurance for losses related to COVID-19, saying that, the existence of the virus in property, led to the closure orders. The closure orders have led people to, lost income and business interruption. And it's one of those things that there's a lot of arguments on both sides, and it's kind of slowly winding its way through the courts. I don't think we've had a Texas court actually rule one way or the other as to whether or not these COVID-related losses are covered under business interruption coverages or not, but it's something to look to and to consider making a claim for if you've had those sorts of losses to your company. But these coverages are very different. It's important to read your policy. It's important to look at the exclusions. They can cover a lot or a little. They cover lost profits, and they can calculate those in different ways. They can cover extra expenses, which can be very broad and can cover all sorts of things, or it can be more limited to, having to hire a security guard to watch your business because, there's no wall or there's no door anymore. There are civil authority coverages, which can, which are also can be very broad or very narrow. So these sometimes cover, government acts, which is where some of these COVID claims have come in. The curfews with a hurricane or riots or something like that, business closures and road closures. These can provide you a hook into getting some coverage for your business interruption or business income losses, but it really depends on the language of the policies. Some of these say it has to be a closure within at your property, or a closure within 10 miles of your property. And so that can make a huge difference as to whether or not there's coverage for you or not. Similarly, ingress egress is something that just provides that if people can't get to your business, that you're entitled to recover some of those business losses. But this one also is very different in the way that it's written. We've seen them where it has to be literally the road to your, on your property, that there has to be a tree fallen or the road is out. Others, the ingress egress can be within 5 miles or 10 miles. And so if there are a lot of road closures in the area and people aren't getting around, that might be one way to argue that there's coverage for you if your business has gone down. Employee payroll is also one of those things that there can be specific coverages for under these policies. But again, they vary a lot. They can have specific limitations. We've seen ingress, egress coverages that you can't get any coverage for the first 72 hours, or it's subject to there's a $1 million limited policy, but there's a $10,000 sublimit for some of these coverages, and some of them require additional deductibles. One other thing I wanted to add about commercial property is that if you have a big business income loss, if your business is shut down for a long time, these claims can get really complicated. A lot of times you need an accountant to come in and help, prove how what happened to your property has caused the loss. And so a lot of times insurers will do that. We'll figure that out by looking to what you would have earned or what your profit would have been had there been no interruption versus, what you earned with the interruption. And some policies also include some coverage in there for preparing your claims or for hiring accountants and coming up and figuring out how to paper up your business income loss that can help you get those kinds of losses paid. One other thing to consider if you have a property loss, a property damage, is in 2017, the Texas legislature passed what we call the hailstorm bill. It was a response to a lot of litigation over hail claims all across Texas, and they created a new part of the insurance code that applies to property claims arising from forces of nature, and that's earthquakes, wildfires, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, hail, wind, snowstorms, or rainstorms. And this provision in the insurance code just makes it a little bit harder to recover some of the things that you could recover for these claims before. So you have to give special notice. If you're going to file a lawsuit for one of these kinds of claims, you have to give notice to the insurance company and give them a chance to respond. There are some specific provisions that I guess a lot of lawyers were making crazy, outlandish demands. And so one of the things is you have to give them you have to provide notice of your loss, and your attorney's fees and how much you can recover is based on your actual losses that you can prove at trial compared to what you claimed originally in your demand to the insurance company. And one of the other great things about being a policyholder when you have an insurance claim is that under the insurance code, for a lot of different kinds of claims, you can get 18% statutory interest if the insurer hasn't paid a claim. But for these particular types of claims, it's been reduced. It's 5% plus whatever the judgment percentage is. Right now, it's about 10%. Crime policies are another type of first-party policies. Sometimes are standalone policies. Sometimes these are something that are included in a property policy or some other kind of policy. And these provide coverage for crime-related losses. If you have an employee who's stolen things, if there's forgery or alteration, if someone has stolen money from you, if you have computer and funds transfer fraud, or you've received counterfeit currency, all of these things can be covered by a crime policy. And like I said, these can be included in a property policy, or they can be an add-on to a cyber policy. And it's one of the most used cyber coverages that we see. And if you don't have a cyber policy and you've got a crime add-on, it's one place to look for coverage. If you are looking for coverage for phishing or social engineering type scams where you or your clients might have lost some money. But it's important to know that these kinds of policies, there are exclusions. They typically stop coverage once you know about the theft. So if you know that you've got an employee stealing from you, you've got to, as soon as you know, kind of your losses get cut off. They have different provisions for how to determine what loss you can recover, whether it's when you discovered the loss or when you've sustained the loss. And a lot of times these policies, sometimes these issues, if you've got a stealing employee, sometimes those sorts of things can go on for a long period of time. And these policies often will try to pull everything into a single policy period. So you can only get one policy limit for, the related crimes of one person. So that's kind of our overview of the different types of policies. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about some general coverage issues, including Marisa talking about triggering coverage.
I think, because I saw a couple questions come in, why don't we go to slide 40 and make sure we get the tips in and then answer some of these questions, because I know we've got about 10 minutes left. So we're going to sort of wrap these up for y'all and then take questions, because I know this is really dense material. But when a lawsuit is filed, make sure, and again, we probably should have worded this differently, but make sure you know what the definition of claim is. So if a claim is filed, inventory your policies and make sure that you give notice. See how we're turning red in the face saying that over and over? It's because it's really important. That is one of the easiest ways to get yourself into a coverage fight before you even get to the actual substance of the policy language. So go ahead and grab that low-hanging fruit and make sure that your notice is on time. It's the same for property claims. You just want to know, when do I have to give this, and make sure you send them all the things that they require under the policy to give sufficient notice. The second one, respond to inaccuracies in coverage correspondence or engage coverage counsel. So when you submit a claim, you will get back one of three things. One could be they say, we're covering the claim in its entirety. And then you say, yay, this is awesome. This is why I bought insurance. Everything is amazing. The second is that they might send you back some sort of reservation letter. And it means we're covering the claim, but we see some coverage issues with this. So we are going to reserve our rights on certain things. In those types of letters, they might include reasons why they're doing that. They might say something like, this lawsuit that you gave us, yes, it has a negligence claim, but there's also a fraud claim. So we're going to reserve our rights as to the fraud claim because that's definitely not covered, right? So they'll say something like that. If you see inaccuracies in this correspondence, or you think there's something that's not right about it, either correct those factually or call a coverage lawyer if you see a dispute brewing, because there are lots of things hidden in those letters that could mean something that you might not be able to identify. And the third thing that they could do is just deny it, right? So if you disagree with the denial, you can always call someone and have us double check it. Assess potential conflicts of interest early. So this just means, are you noticing that there's something kind of fishy with the insurer? They seem to be working against your interests in the lawsuit, or their hired defense counsel does. Well, then you need to see if there might be a conflict of interest there and address it. Understand the coverage issues and avoid a course of action that would defeat or reduce coverage. What we mean here is that particularly in a third-party context, but also in a property context, also in a first-party context, there are ways to structure your claim or the settlement to fit within the box of coverage. So if you have a lawsuit that alleges negligence or something like that, and it also alleges fraud, we'll go back to that example, you might not want your lawyer to file a motion for summary judgment on the negligence claim, because that gets rid of the covered claim, which gets rid of your coverage for the entire lawsuit. So if you kind of know what the coverage is based on, then you can be a lot more strategic about the way that you go about the lawsuit or the first party claim. The last one here, ensure that insured appointed defense counsel keep your company's interests first. They do owe an unqualified loyalty to you. You are the client. So that ties into this conflict of interest idea. They should be looking out for your interests, not the insurance companies. And then the next slide, I think we have a few more for first party claims. Just make sure you keep a good record of your damages. Don't, go fixing the problem and not have pictures, or just make sure that you can show your loss and you document everything really well. You keep organized records. You hold on to the damaged property because the insurer will come out to inspect it. You keep records of extra expenses or temporary repair costs. Just document these first party losses to make sure there aren't questions later. And then when you are talking to the insurance company, make sure that you save all of those emails. Okay, so make sure that you are maintaining that correspondence so that if a problem comes up, we can go back and look at it later.